On a desperate night, a millionaire runs through the dark streets of the city, searching for his 6-year-old son, who disappeared during a walk in the park. His hands tremble with anxiety as he enters a poorly lit alley, when suddenly a small, injured beggar girl approaches him crying, "Sir, help me, my friend fainted." She points to a small figure lying on the ground unconscious. The millionaire approaches to help and almost faints when he recognizes that the unconscious boy is his own missing son. When he asks the girl why she is injured, her explanation makes him break down in tears. The rain beat mercilessly against the dark asphalt, creating puddles that reflected the jaundiced glow of the streetlights like shattered mirrors of Edward Thorne's soul. His footsteps echoed desperately through the empty New York City streets, each beat of his heart a war drum pounding against the dwindling time. His Italian suit, once impeccable, was now soaked and wrinkled, but none of that mattered. Only one thing occupied his tormented mind: finding Gabriel. 3 hours had passed since he'd gotten the call from the nanny. 3 hours of pure terror that felt like an eternity. "Mr. Thorne, I only lost sight of Gabriel for a minute in the park. When I turned back, he was gone." The words still echoed in his ears like a death sentence. He had immediately abandoned the most important meeting of the year, ignoring the protests of the Japanese investors, and rushed into the streets in search of his 6-year-old son. The smell of rain on hot asphalt, petrichor mixed with the city's grime, created a suffocating atmosphere, as if the city itself were conspiring against him. Edward had never felt so small, so vulnerable. For decades, he had controlled financial empires, dominated boardrooms with his imposing presence, but now he wandered the streets like a defeated man. His billion-dollar fortune couldn't buy the one thing he needed most: Gabriel's whereabouts. Painful memories began to invade his mind as he ran. How many times had he cancelled outings with the boy because of meetings? How many broken promises? How many times had he said, "We'll talk later, Daddy's busy"? Guilt weighed on his shoulders like molten lead. Gabriel would always look at him with those hopeful brown eyes, waiting for an attention that never truly came. The cold wind cut his face, mixing with tears he didn't even realize he was shedding. Edward Thorne, the man who never showed weakness, who had built his reputation on absolute control and calculated coldness, was now crying desperately in the streets. Every alley he explored without success was a stab to his chest. Every face that wasn't Gabriel's heightened his agony. His rational mind tried to organize the facts. Gabriel was wearing a blue Spider-Man t-shirt, red sneakers, and was carrying his small backpack with a few toys. He was 6, shy with strangers, but far too curious for his own good. This information had already been given to the police, but Edward couldn't just wait at home. He had to do something, anything. Desperation led him to places he never imagined he'd set foot in. Dark alleys, dangerous streets, abandoned parts of the city. Strangers eyed him with suspicion, seeing this well-dressed man searching for something so desperately. Some ignored him. Others asked questions he answered in a choked voice. "My son, a 6-year-old boy, have you seen him?" With every no he received, he felt his world crumble a little more. How had it come to this? How had he allowed his relationship with Gabriel to deteriorate so badly? The boy used to try to talk to him during breakfast, but Edward was always glued to his tablet, checking the stock market fluctuations. "Daddy, can you play with me today?" was a question he heard almost daily, and his answer was always the same. "Not today, son. Daddy has important work to do." Now, running frantically through the wet streets, Edward finally understood that there was no work more important than being a father. No meeting, no contract, no investment was worth more than one of Gabriel's smiles, his small hands reaching for his simple pleas for attention and affection. The watch on his wrist showed it was nearly midnight when Edward turned into a dimly lit alley, following an inexplicable gut feeling. The darkness here seemed thicker, charged with mystery and danger. His footsteps echoed against the damp walls, a ghostly sound that amplified his anguish. It was then that he heard a small, frightened voice cut through the night's silence. "Mister, help me!" Edward's heart nearly stopped as a tiny figure emerged from the shadows. The girl who stepped out of the alley was a sight that cut through Edward like a sharp blade. She couldn't have been more than 6, the same age as Gabriel, yet she seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of suffering on her shoulders. Her clothes were torn and filthy, revealing fresh wounds on her face and arms. Tears streamed down her thin cheeks, leaving clean trails through the grime that covered her delicate skin. "Mister, help me," she repeated, her small voice trembling with fear and urgency. "My friend passed out." Her large, dark eyes shone with a hopelessness no child should ever know, but also with a surprising determination. She pointed to a small figure lying on the ground a few feet away, almost invisible in the alley's gloom. Edward felt his legs tremble as he approached the unconscious figure. Each step felt like an eternity, each heartbeat a funeral bell in his ears. When he finally knelt beside the inert body, his vision blurred and the world seemed to stop completely. It was Gabriel. His son was there, pale and still, his lips slightly blue, his breathing almost imperceptible. "Gabriel!" Edward cried out, his voice echoing off the alley walls like an ancient lament. His trembling hands touched the boy's cold face, searching for signs of life. The pulse was weak, but it was there. Uncontrollable tears began to fall onto Gabriel's face, mixing with the rain that still fell softly. The girl came closer, her own wounds bleeding, but her focus was entirely on helping. "He was playing with me, then he got real pale and just fell down," she explained with the devastating innocence of a child. "I tried to wake him up, but he wouldn't. I didn't know what to do, so I just stayed here to watch over him, waiting for someone to come." Edward looked at the small figure beside him, realizing for the first time the extraordinary courage she had shown. This girl, clearly homeless, injured and terrified, had stayed by Gabriel's side to protect him. While he, the father, was in business meetings, a stranger had become his son's guardian. "How did you get hurt?" Edward asked, trying to keep his voice steady as he checked Gabriel's vitals. The girl looked down, her small hands shaking visibly. "Some bad men came and tried to take him," she whispered, as if the words burned her throat. "I threw rocks at them and screamed real loud until they ran away. They hurt me, but I didn't let them take my friend." The impact of her words hit Edward like a lightning bolt. Bad men tried to take Gabriel. This small, fragile girl had faced kidnappers to protect his son. She had risked her own life, suffered injuries, all to save a child she barely knew. The gratitude he felt was so intense, it nearly knocked him over. "You are so brave," Edward managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. So brave." He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his hands still shaking. As he spoke with the operator, he couldn't stop looking at the girl, who remained by Gabriel's side like a tiny sentinel. "What's your name?" he asked after he hung up. The girl hesitated for a moment, as if she wasn't used to being asked about herself. "Maria," she answered quietly. "I live around here. I stay around here." The way she corrected herself revealed a painful truth Edward chose not to probe at that moment. While they waited for the ambulance, Edward held Gabriel's hand and watched Maria. She was clearly in shock, but her primary concern was still Gabriel's well-being. She checked his breathing constantly, adjusted his position to make him more comfortable, and whispered words of encouragement as if he could hear her. "He's going to be okay," Maria said, more to herself than to Edward. He has to be. He's my only real friend." The purity and pain in those words broke something fundamental inside Edward. This girl, who clearly had nothing, had found a precious friendship in Gabriel and had fought to protect it. The approaching sirens brought both hope and fear. Edward knew the battle for Gabriel's life was just beginning. The hospital was a blur of motion when the ambulance arrived. Edward held Maria's hand as they rushed through the sterile white hallways, following the gurney carrying Gabriel into the emergency room. The girl, though injured and exhausted, refused to let go of Gabriel's hand, murmuring words of encouragement that only a pure friendship could inspire. "Sir, you need to stay here," a nurse said, stopping Edward from entering. "The ER. The doctors need room to work." He nodded reluctantly, but Maria tried to push past. "I have to stay with him. He'll be scared if he wakes up alone." Edward gently hugged her, feeling her tremble with exhaustion and trauma. "He's in good hands. Now, Maria, you did everything you could. You saved him." The words came out with difficulty, heavy with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. This little girl had shown more courage and loyalty in one night than he had in years of fatherhood. While they waited for news, a nurse approached to tend to Maria's injuries. The girl resisted at first, clearly unaccustomed to receiving medical care, but Edward reassured her. "You need to take care of those cuts, little hero. Gabriel would be sad to know you got hurt because of him." During the treatment, Edward noticed every scar, every wound on Maria's frail body. They weren't just the fresh injuries from the fight. There were old marks, signs of a life on the streets that no child should ever know. Her clothes were so worn they barely served as protection from the cold. Her bare feet were calloused and cut, indicating months, perhaps years, of walking on rough city streets. "Maria," Edward said softly, "where are your parents?" The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The girl stopped fidgeting and looked at him with a sadness that was far too mature for her age. "My mom died a while ago. I don't have anyone else." The simplicity of her answer was more devastating than any drama could be. "How long have you been on your own?" Edward asked, his heart breaking a little more. "A few months," Maria replied, shrugging as if it were nothing. "I manage okay. I know where to find food and places to sleep, and now I had Gabriel as a friend." The word "had" hit him like a punch to the gut. For Maria, Gabriel wasn't just a friend. He was her emotional anchor, her only meaningful human connection in a world that had abandoned her. And now she was terrified of losing him too. Dr. Evans, the physician in charge, finally emerged from the ER with a serious but hopeful expression. "Your son is stable," he said, and Edward felt his knees almost give out in relief. "But we need to talk about his condition." In his office, away from Maria's ears, the doctor explained, "Gabriel had a severe diabetic crisis. He has type 1 diabetes, a condition that will need to be managed for the rest of his life. If that little girl hadn't found him when she did, the consequences could have been fatal." Edward felt the world spin. Diabetes. How had he not seen the signs? How had he been so negligent with his own son's health? "How long has he had it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Likely for a few months. But the symptoms can be subtle at first. Excessive thirst, fatigue, weight loss. These are things an attentive parent might have noticed." The doctor wasn't being intentionally cruel, but his words were like blades. An attentive parent. Edward had not been an attentive parent. He had been so busy building a financial empire that he had completely missed the decline in his only son's health. "The girl who brought him in," Dr. Evans continued, "she needs care too. She's malnourished, shows signs of prolonged exposure, and the injuries she sustained tonight need follow-up. Has anyone called Child Protective Services?" Edward shook his head, a new worry taking root in his heart. If CPS took Maria, Gabriel would lose the girl who saved him, the only person who had shown him true care when his own father was absent. "Can I see him now?" Edward asked. The doctor nodded and led him to the room where Gabriel was resting, hooked up to monitors with an IV in his arm. Maria had managed to convince a nurse to let her in and was sitting by the bed, holding Gabriel's hand with extreme care. Gabriel slowly opened his eyes and smiled when he saw Maria. "You stayed with me," he whispered, his voice weak but full of gratitude. Then his eyes found Edward's, and for the first time in years, there was no disappointment in them, just pure relief at seeing his father. "Dad," Gabriel whispered, extending his free hand toward Edward. "Maria saved me. She's so brave." His eyes, still weak from the diabetic crisis, shone with pure admiration for the girl who remained by his side like a small guardian. Edward approached the bed, a lump forming in his throat as he saw how Gabriel looked at Maria with the affection he, as a father, had always yearned to inspire. Maria smiled shyly at Gabriel, squeezing his hand gently. "I told you I'd stay with you until you got better," she murmured. "Friends don't leave friends." The simplicity of her words carried an emotional weight that made Edward realize how much he had neglected the most basic human values: loyalty, companionship, unconditional love. For the next 3 days, Edward practically lived at the hospital. He cancelled all his meetings, ignored urgent calls from investors, and for the first time in years, put something above his business: Gabriel's recovery. He watched, fascinated, as Maria cared for his son with a dedication that put his own fatherhood to shame. She knew exactly when Gabriel needed water, noticed his discomfort even before the monitors beeped. "How did you two meet?" Edward asked one afternoon, sitting between the two children. Gabriel and Maria exchanged a conspiratorial look that spoke of shared secrets and a genuine friendship that had blossomed in the unlikeliest of circumstances. "I used to see her sometimes near school," Gabriel began, his voice still weak but filled with affection. "The other kids would run from her or say mean things, but I just thought she looked sad, not scary." Maria looked down, clearly embarrassed by the attention, but Gabriel continued. "One day I shared my lunch with her. The nanny didn't see, and after that, we became secret friends." Edward's heart tightened. While he was in endless meetings, his son had formed a secret friendship because he knew his father wouldn't approve. At 6 years old, Gabriel had already learned to hide important parts of his life because he felt he couldn't share them with his own dad. "Why was it a secret?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. Gabriel hesitated, glancing nervously at Maria before answering. Because I knew you'd say it was dangerous to talk to in people from the street. But Maria isn't dangerous, Dad. She's just lonely, like I feel sometimes." Gabriel's words were a punch to Edward's gut. Lonely. His son felt lonely, even with a billionaire father who could give him anything material. But he had failed to give him the one thing that truly mattered: genuine presence, attention, love, shown through shared time. Maria finally looked at Edward, her large, dark eyes carrying a premature wisdom. "Gabriel is different from the other boys," she said softly. "He doesn't look at me like I'm dirty or bad. He sees, I don't know how to explain it, he sees who I am inside, not just my old clothes." Edward realized this 6-year-old girl had articulated something that he, with all his education and life experience, had failed to grasp: that a person's worth isn't measured by their possessions or appearance, but by the kindness of their heart. Gabriel had learned this lesson on his own, through his natural compassion, not from his father's teachings. During the night, once the children had finally fallen asleep, Edward stepped into the hospital corridor to make calls that could no longer be postponed. His assistant had left dozens of urgent messages, and his 3-day absence had caused a small crisis in several major deals. "Mr. Thorne," his assistant said as soon as she answered, "the Japanese investors are furious. They're threatening to pull out of the deal entirely if you don't attend the meeting tomorrow. And Mr. Martinez has called 5 times today saying he needs to speak with you urgently about the Chicago development project." Martinez, his oldest, most trusted partner. Edward had worked with him for over 15 years, building an empire together that spanned 3 continents. If Martinez was calling insistently, it had to be serious. "Patch him through now," Edward instructed, leaning against the hospital wall. Seconds later, Martinez's familiar voice was on the line, but there was something different in his tone, an urgency Edward couldn't place. "Edward, where the hell are you? I need to talk to you in person. It's about the incident with Gabriel. There are things you need to know, things I can't say over the phone." A chill ran down Edward's spine. Martinez knew about the attempted kidnapping. How? And why did his voice sound so strange? The next morning, while Gabriel slept peacefully and Maria rested in the armchair beside his bed like a vigilant little guardian, Edward finally found time to look into the investigation of the foiled kidnapping. The police officers on the case had come to the hospital to gather more details, and their questions began to reveal disturbing aspects of the incident. "Mr. Thorne," said Detective Miller, a middle-aged man with tired eyes that had seen too much, "we've got some intel on them. Men who tried to take your son. Based on the girl's description and evidence from the scene, we believe they were professionals. This wasn't a crime of opportunity." Edward's blood ran cold. "Professionals? You mean this was—" He couldn't finish the question, but the detective nodded grimly. "A planned abduction, sir. They knew your son's routine, where he played, the best time to strike. Someone with access to inside information about your family fed it to them." The revelation hit Edward like a physical blow. Someone close had betrayed his family, put Gabriel in mortal danger. Who could have done it? His mind raced through the possibilities. Household staff, security, colleagues, partners. Paranoia began to grow like a poisonous weed. Maria, who had woken up during the conversation, timidly tugged on Edward's sleeve. "Mister," she whispered, her eyes still haunted by the trauma, "I remember something important." All heads turned to her, and the detective knelt to meet her gaze. "Can you tell us, sweetie? Any detail could help." "The taller man," Maria began, her voice trembling slightly. "He was on the phone before he tried to grab Gabriel. He said, 'Yes, Mr. Martinez, we're taking the boy now.' I remember because I thought it was a funny name." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward felt the floor open up beneath him. Martinez, his partner of 15 years, the man he trusted like a brother, had orchestrated Gabriel's kidnapping. The insistent calls, the urgency in his voice. It all made sense now. Martinez wasn't worried about business. He was trying to find out how much Edward knew about his betrayal. "Mr. Thorne," the detective said carefully, "do you know a Martinez who would have access to your family's routine?" Edward nodded slowly, a wave of nausea rising in his stomach. "Carlos Martinez, my partner for 15 years. He knows every detail of my personal life." The detective made a few notes and stood up. "We'll need to pursue this lead very carefully. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you do not make contact with this Mr. Martinez until we can gather more evidence, and I suggest police protection for your family." After the police left, Edward was alone with the children and a devastating reality. Not only had he failed as a father by neglecting Gabriel, but his obsession with financial success had drawn dangerous people into his family's orbit. Martinez wasn't just his partner, he was Gabriel's godfather. He had been there for every important moment in the boy's life. How had he been so blind? How had he not seen that the man he trusted was planning to destroy his family? The guilt and rage churned in his chest, a toxic cocktail threatening to suffocate him. Maria approached him with the peculiar intuition of children who have learned to read adult emotions to survive. "Are you sad, Mr. Edward?" she asked, placing her small hand on his arm. The kindness of her gesture from a child who had every reason to distrust adults almost made him weep. "I'm worried," Edward admitted, realizing that for the first time in years he was being honest about his feelings with a child. "I found out that someone I trusted very much did something very bad to our family." Maria nodded with a wisdom far beyond her 6 years. "I know what that's like," she said softly. "My mum trusted her boss and he hurt her really bad. Sometimes the people who seem nice do bad things." Edward looked at her, surprised. "Your mom, can you tell me about her?" Maria hesitated, glancing at the still sleeping Gabriel as if drawing courage from his presence. "She worked at a big company like you. Her boss said she did something wrong and fired her. After that, we lost our apartment and had to live on the street." "What was the name of the company?" Edward asked, a terrible premonition growing in his chest. Maria frowned, trying to remember. "It had Thorn in the name. My mom always said one day we'd find the owner and tell him the truth about what really happened." Edward's world stopped. Maria's mother had worked for his company. She had been fired unjustly, possibly by Martinez, and had ended up on the streets with her young daughter. The girl who had saved Gabriel was the daughter of an employee he had failed to protect. The name of Maria's mother was Anna Coleman. As Edward frantically searched his company's HR archives on his laptop, the truth began to unravel like a macabre tapestry. Anna had been one of the most dedicated employees in the finance department, working at Thorn Capital for 5 years until she was abruptly fired 8 months ago, exactly when Maria said her mother lost her job. Edward found the termination file, and his heart sank as he read the details. Anna had been accused of embezzlement, a serious charge that had not only resulted in her immediate dismissal, but also a criminal complaint that had completely ruined her reputation. And who had signed the termination paperwork? Carlos Martinez. Edward's hands trembled as he read further. Anna had vehemently contested the accusations, claiming she had discovered irregularities in the accounting ledgers and was preparing a report for the board when she was fired. She had tried to schedule meetings with Edward personally, but they had all been blocked by Martinez's assistant, who claimed the CEO was too busy to deal with minor HR issues. The irony was devastating. While Edward was in meetings too important to hear out Anna Coleman, her daughter was living on the streets, developing the courage and compassion that would one day save Gabriel's life. The universe had woven a web of connections that now revealed itself with painful clarity. Edward closed the laptop and looked at Maria, who was gently helping a now awake Gabriel sip some water. This small, resilient girl was the daughter of a woman he had failed, a woman destroyed by a system he had created by giving Martinez too much power. Anna Coleman had died on the streets because Edward was too busy building an empire to notice it was being rotted from within. "Maria," Edward said softly, approaching the bed where Gabriel was finally awake and alert. "Can I tell you a story about your mom?" The girl's eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and pain. It was clear she didn't get many chances to talk about Anna, and any memory was precious. "Your mom worked for me," Edward began, choosing his words carefully. "She was a very good, very honest person so honest that she discovered when someone else was doing bad things at the company. Unfortunately, that bad person managed to make everyone think your mum was the one doing wrong. Maria nodded with an understanding that broke Edward's heart. "I knew my mum didn't do bad things," she said simply. "She always told me to tell the truth, even when it was hard. She said honest people always find a way to do the right thing." Gabriel, who had been listening silently, took Maria's hand. "Like you did with me," he said with the crystal-clear logic of a child. "You told the truth about the bad men, even when you were hurt and scared." Maria smiled at him, and Edward saw in her face a reflection of the goodness her mother must have possessed. "I want to tell you both something important," Edward said, sitting on the edge of the bed to be at their eye level. "I've made some very big mistakes. I wasn't paying attention to the things that really mattered, and good people got hurt because of it. Maria's mom was one of those people, and so were both of you." Gabriel frowned, confused. "How was I hurt, Dad?" "It was just the bad men who tried to take me." Edward swallowed hard, realizing he had to be honest with his son in a way he never had before. "Gabriel, I hurt you in a different way. I wasn't there for you when you needed me. I didn't notice you were sick. I didn't realize you felt lonely. And I didn't see that you had a special friend who needed help." The words came out with difficulty, but Edward knew this conversation was necessary. "You didn't know I had diabetes," Gabriel said, surprising Edward with his capacity for forgiveness. "But you know now, and you're here now." The simplicity of Gabriel's forgiveness was more powerful than any absolution Edward could have received. A nurse entered the room with a worried expression. "Mr. Thorne, there's a social worker here who needs to speak with you about the girl's situation. She's waiting in the hall." Edward felt his stomach clench. He knew this moment was coming, but he wasn't prepared to face the possibility of losing Maria just after discovering her connection to his family. Outside the room, the social worker, Carla Reynolds, was waiting with a folder full of documents and an expression Edward had learned to dread. She represented a bureaucratic system that, while well-intentioned, could tear apart two children who clearly loved and supported each other. "Mr. Thorne," said Carla Reynolds, the social worker, her professional tone barely masking a genuine compassion, "Maria needs to be transferred to a group home until we can find a suitable foster placement. We know she's developed a bond with your son, but we can't prolong an irregular situation indefinitely." Edward felt the floor drop out from under him. "She saved my son's life," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "They have a special bond. Separating them now would be traumatic for both of them." Carla nodded with understanding but held her ground. "I understand the situation, sir, but Maria is an unaccompanied minor in need of specialized care. The group home in Westchester can provide that. It's an excellent facility, just a couple of hours from the city." 2 hours. To Maria and Gabriel, it might as well have been on the other side of the world. "Can I talk to her first?" Edward asked. "She deserves to know what's happening." Carla reluctantly agreed, and they returned to the room where the two children were talking quietly, creating imaginary worlds where they would always be together. When Edward gently explained the transfer, the effect was devastating. Gabriel began to cry silently, clinging to Maria's hand as if he could physically stop her from leaving. Maria, showing the emotional fortitude she had developed through months of survival, tried to comfort him even as she faced yet another abandonment. "Don't cry, Gabriel," she whispered, wiping his tears with her small hands. "I'll come visit whenever I can, and you'll make new friends at school, kids who don't have to be a secret." The maturity in her words broke something inside Edward. It was in that moment, seeing Gabriel's despair and Maria's heroic resignation, that Edward made the most important decision of his life. "What if I wanted to adopt Maria?" he asked suddenly, surprising even himself. The silence in the room was absolute. Carla looked at him with professional skepticism. "Mr. Thorne, adoption is a complex, lengthy process. It requires psychological evaluations, home visits, background checks. It can take months, even years, especially for a single father with your demanding career." "Then let's start today," Edward said, with a determination he hadn't felt in years. "I want the paperwork started immediately. In the meantime, can Maria stay under my temporary guardianship?" Carla shook her head. "It doesn't work that way, sir. The system has protocols to protect the child's best interests. Maria needs to go to the group home until a full assessment is completed." The bureaucracy Edward navigated so easily in the business world was now an impassable maze when it came to what truly mattered. Gabriel stood up from the bed for the first time since being admitted, still weak but resolute. "I don't want her to go," he said with a firmness that startled all the adults. "Maria is my best friend. She saved me. Why do people want to separate? Friends?" Gabriel's simple question echoed in the room like a bell of truth. Why indeed was a system designed to protect children about to traumatize two of them by severing a friendship, born of pure love and sacrifice? That night, after Carla had left with a promise to return the next morning for Maria, Edward made a decision that would change everything. He called the best family law attorney he knew, then private investigators, and finally journalists he trusted. If the system couldn't be navigated quickly through normal channels, he would use every resource at his disposal to protect Maria. But there was something more urgent he had to do first. Carlos Martinez had called 3 more times, each call more insistent. It was time to confront the man who had betrayed his family and destroyed the life of Maria's mother. Edward asked 2 nurses to stay with the children and left the hospital for the first time in a week. The meeting would be in a public place, a coffee shop downtown, where Martinez wouldn't dare try anything desperate. When Edward arrived at the coffee shop, Martinez was already there, looking nervous and agitated. 15 years of partnership had taught Edward how to read his partner, and right now he saw guilt, fear, and a dangerous determination. "Edward," Martinez said, standing as he approached, "we need to talk about these rumors that are flying around. Someone is trying to undermine us, making up stories about what happened to Gabriel." Edward sat down calmly, watching how Martinez avoided his gaze. "What stories, Carlos?" he asked, his voice neutral. "And how did you know what happened to Gabriel before I told anyone?" The silence that followed was telling. Martinez realized his slip-up, that he had revealed knowledge he shouldn't have had. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, and Edward knew with absolute certainty that he was sitting across from the man who had ordered the kidnapping of his own godson. "Carlos," Edward said, his voice low but laced with a cold authority that made Martinez shrink in his chair. "A 6-year-old girl was able to identify your voice during the kidnapping. She clearly remembered you giving orders to the abductors." Martinez's face went white, his hands shaking so badly he had to plant them on the table. "Edward, you're losing your mind," he protested, but his voice was strangled. "Why would I do something like that? We've been partners for 15 years. I'm Gabriel's godfather." His own words seemed to turn on him, revealing the depth of his betrayal. "That's exactly why it's so devastating," Edward replied, a strange calm settling over him. "You knew every detail of Gabriel's life. You knew where he played, the nanny's routine. You had access to our home. It was the perfect crime, wasn't it, Carlos? Kidnap your own partner's son and then show up as the sympathetic shoulder to cry on." Martinez tried to stand, but Edward made a nearly imperceptible gesture, and 2 men in dark suits at nearby tables shifted their positions. The private investigators Edward had hired had arrived before him, documenting every word. "Sit down," Edward said quietly, "We're not done. I want you to tell me about Anna Coleman." The name hit Martinez like a physical blow. His expression shifted from desperate denial to absolute panic. "Anna Coleman discovered your financial misconduct, didn't she?" Edward continued, watching Martinez slowly crumble. "She was preparing a report on the money you'd been embezzling from the company for years, so you framed her for it, ruined her reputation, and condemned her to poverty." "Edward, I can explain," Martinez began, his voice a desperate whisper. "The company was struggling. I needed liquidity for some personal investments. It was temporary. I was going to pay it all back." "Anna Coleman died on the streets." "Carlos! She died because you destroyed her life to cover your crimes, and her daughter, a 6-year-old girl, had to learn to survive on her own." Edward's voice trembled with contained rage. "That same girl you condemned to a life of neglect is the one who saved my son from the kidnappers you hired." The cosmic irony of it all finally hit Martinez with its full force. He had destroyed Maria's life, and in turn, she had thwarted his plan to kidnap Gabriel. Fate had woven a circle of justice he could never have predicted. "Why Carlos?" Edward asked a genuine question in his voice. 15 years of partnership, of shared profits. Why risk it all? Martinez finally met Edward's gaze, and what he saw there was more devastating than rage, profound disappointment. "Because you always had everything," Martinez exploded, all pretense finally gone. "You were born into it. You inherited the connections. You had every opportunity. I had to fight for every scrap, and I was still just the junior partner, always in your shadow. You never even noticed how much I contributed to our success." "So you decided to destroy me?" Edward asked, incredulous. "To destroy my family as revenge for some imagined slight?" Martinez hung his head, finally grasping the monstrosity of his actions. "The kidnapping was supposed to be clean," he whispered. "Gabriel would be gone for a few days. You'd pay the ransom, and he'd come back safe. I'd use the money to cover what I'd taken, and no one would get hurt." Edward felt sick, hearing Martinez's twisted logic. And what if something had gone wrong? What if Gabriel had been hurt? What if he had died because of your greed? Each question was a slap to Martinez's face. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," Martinez said, tears now streaming down his face. "When I heard Gabriel was in the hospital, that he had diabetes. Edward, I swear I didn't know. If I had known he was sick—" "You would have called it off?" Edward asked with bitter sarcasm. "How noble of you, Carlos. It's so comforting to know you would have spared my son if you'd known he could die." The contempt in his voice was sharper than any shout. Edward stood, signaling to his investigators. "The police already have enough to arrest you, Carlos, but I wanted to look you in the eye and understand how the man I considered a brother became this despicable." Martinez tried one last desperate gambit. "Edward, think of the company, the employees, the investors. If this gets out, everything we've built will be destroyed. We can handle this between us, like we always have." Edward paused and looked back. "The company will survive. The honest employees will be protected. And as for the investors, they deserve to know what kind of man my partner was." He paused, letting the weight of his next word settle. "You'll be arrested tomorrow morning, and I'm going to make sure Anna Coleman finally gets the justice she deserved." As Edward walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Martinez under the watch of the investigators until the police arrived, he felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The betrayal was exposed, justice would be served, but 15 years of friendship and partnership had been built on a lie. Edward returned to the hospital with a heavy but determined heart. Martinez's confession had been recorded, and the police were on their way to make the arrest, but a much bigger battle awaited him. stopping Maria from being taken to the group home in the morning. When he entered the room, he found a scene that almost brought him to tears. Gabriel was teaching Maria how to play checkers on a small board a nurse had lent them. The two children were completely absorbed, laughing quietly so as not to disturb the other patients. Maria moved the pieces with extreme care, as if afraid to break them, while Gabriel patiently explained the rules. "Dad," Gabriel exclaimed when he saw him, his eyes shining, "Maria's a fast learner. She's already beaten me twice." Maria smiled shyly at Edward, but he could see the sadness behind her eyes. She knew this was likely her last night with Gabriel. "Can I talk to you guys about something important?" Edward said, sitting on the edge of the bed. The children stopped playing and gave him their full attention. "Maria, would you like to come live with me and Gabriel forever?" The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Maria looked from Gabriel to Edward as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. "You mean like a real family?" she asked, her voice a near whisper. "Exactly like a real family," Edward confirmed. "With your own room, toys, school and everything. A girl your age should have." Gabriel, though still weak, leapt from the bed and hugged Maria tightly. "I told you my dad would figure something out," he shouted with joy. "Now you can be my real sister." Maria started to cry, but they were tears of joy mixed with the natural distrust of someone who had been let down too many times. "But the lady said it was hard," Maria said, referring to the social worker, "that it takes a long time and might not happen." Edward knelt in front of her, looking directly into her eyes. "Maria, I promise you, I will do everything in my power to make sure you stay with us. It might take a little time, it might be complicated, but I will not give up. Ever." The sincerity in his voice convinced her he meant it. That night, Edward worked tirelessly. He called top family law attorneys, contacted child psychologists for emergency evaluations, and even reached out to friendly journalists to document the extraordinary story of how Maria had saved Gabriel. If the bureaucracy was slow, he would use public pressure to speed it up. Albert Reed Eskin, the most respected family lawyer in the city, arrived at the hospital at 2 in the morning. Edward had offered an obscene amount of money for the emergency consultation, but it was the story of the children that truly motivated him. "Mr. Thorne," Mr. Reed said after hearing all the details, "what you're proposing is technically possible, but it will require proving that separating the children would cause significant psychological trauma. We'll need evaluations from child psychologists, detailed medical reports, and preferably media coverage that forces the system to act quickly." "Whatever it takes," Edward said without hesitation. "How much time do you need?" Mr. Reed glanced at his watch and did some mental calculations. "If we work through the night, we can have a petition for temporary custody ready to file with a judge at 8 a.m. It's a long shot, but it's possible." While the lawyers worked, Edward returned to the children's room. Maria had fallen asleep next to Gabriel, their small hands intertwined as if not even sleep could part them. The sight was so touching that Edward had to lean against the wall to keep his composure. A nurse approached him quietly. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered, "if I may say something. In 20 years at this hospital, I have never seen two children with a connection this strong. It's like they're two halves of the same soul. It would be a cruelty to separate them now." Edward nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. This wasn't just about giving Maria a home. It was about preserving a friendship born of pure love and mutual sacrifice. It was about honoring Anna Coleman's memory by ensuring her daughter had the life she had dreamed for her. At 5 a.m., Carla Reynolds arrived at the hospital earlier than planned, accompanied by 2 staff members from the group home. Edward intercepted her in the hallway, still in the same clothes from the night before, his eyes red with fatigue, but his resolve unshaken. "Mr. Thorne," Carla said with genuine sympathy, "I know this is difficult, but Maria needs to come with us now. The longer we draw this out, the harder it will be for her." Edward took a deep breath, knowing the next few minutes were crucial. "Carla, I need you to give me 1 hour, just 1 hour before you take her. There are legal developments that could change everything." Carla frowned, clearly skeptical. "What kind of developments?" she asked. Edward showed her a copy of the temporary custody petition Mr. Reed had finalized just minutes before. "I'm filing for temporary guardianship based on the psychological trauma separation would cause both children, backed by emergency medical and psychological evaluations." Carla quickly read the document, her expression shifting from skepticism to surprise. "Mr. Thorne, this is impressive, but a judge could still deny the petition. I can't risk Maria's well-being on a possibility." It was then that Edward played his final card. "And what if I resigned as CEO of my company to dedicate myself full-time to the children? What if I created a foundation in Maria's mother's name to help other children in similar situations? Would that demonstrate my genuine commitment?" Carla's silence was telling. For the first time, she was seriously considering his proposal. By 7:30 a.m., the hospital was in an uproar. Journalists had arrived to cover the extraordinary story of Maria and Gabriel. Child psychologists were finalizing their emergency reports, and lawyers were rushing through the halls with legal documents. At the center of this chaos, 2 children remained, huddled together on a hospital bed, oblivious to the epic battle being waged for them to stay together. Dr. Sandra Lima, the city's most respected child psychologist, emerged from the room after an hour-long evaluation with a grave expression. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "I have rarely seen such an intense emotional codependency between 2 children. Gabriel shows clear signs of severe separation anxiety when asked about the possibility of being parted from Maria. And Maria, she has built a psychological defense mechanism around Gabriel that goes far beyond normal friendship." Edward's heart raced. "What does that mean in legal terms?" Dr. Lima consulted her notes. "It means that forcibly separating these children at this time would cause significant psychological trauma to both. Gabriel could spiral into a deep depression, affecting his diabetes management, and Maria could regress emotionally, losing the progress she's made by finding stability through her friendship with Gabriel." Carla Reynolds, who had observed the entire evaluation, approached with a conflicted expression. "Dr. Lima, as a professional, what would you recommend?" The psychologist didn't hesitate. "I strongly recommend the children remain together during any transitional process. An abrupt separation would be detrimental to both." Carla nodded slowly, clearly torn between bureaucratic protocol and the children's well-being. At 8 a.m. sharp, Mr. Reed returned with news from the courthouse. "The judge has agreed to hear our petition on an emergency basis. We have a hearing scheduled for 10 o'clock. This is our one shot." Edward felt a mix of hope and terror. Everything hinged on the next 2 hours. While the lawyers prepared, Edward made the most radical decision of his life. He called his company's board of directors and convened an emergency video conference. In front of a dozen stunned executives, Edward formally resigned as CEO of Thorne Capital. "As of today," he said into the camera, "I will be dedicating myself full-time to my family and to establishing the Anna Coleman Foundation, dedicated to helping children in vulnerable situations." The shockwave of his decision echoed across social media within minutes. Gabriel and Maria watched the live broadcast on a nurse's tablet, not fully understanding the magnitude of what Edward had just done. "Dad, you're not going to work anymore?" Gabriel asked, confused. Edward knelt beside the bed. "I will be working, son, but on a much more important job. My job will be taking care of you and Maria and helping other kids just like her." Maria looked at him, her expression a mixture of admiration and suspicion. "But aren't you going to lose all your money?" she asked with the practicality of a child who had learned about deprivation firsthand. Edward smiled, realizing Maria was genuinely worried about him. "Maria, I've discovered that true wealth isn't the money we have in the bank, but the people we love and who love us back. You two are worth more than all the money in the world." The simplicity of his answer convinced her of his sincerity. At 9:30, it was time to leave for the courthouse. Edward had arranged for a special ambulance to transport Gabriel, who still required medical monitoring. Maria refused to let go of Gabriel's hand for the entire ride, as if her touch were a protective talisman. At the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. The children's story had touched the city's heart, and dozens of people were there to show their support. Signs with messages like, "Keep the kids together" and "Maria is a hero" created an emotionally charged atmosphere. The judge, Robert Harrison, a man known for his sensitivity in cases involving children, watched carefully as Edward, Gabriel, and Maria entered the courtroom. Gabriel, still weak but determined, held tightly to Maria's hand as she guided him like a tiny nurse. Their mutual dedication was plain for all to see. The assistant district attorney, who would normally oppose such unconventional arrangements, seemed visibly moved by the scene. "Before we begin," Judge Harrison said, "I'd like to speak directly with the children." He stepped down from his bench and knelt in front of Gabriel and Maria, temporarily removing the formality of the judicial setting. "Gabriel," he said softly, "can you tell me how you met Maria?" Gabriel looked to Maria for encouragement, and she nodded with a comforting smile. "I used to see her near school sometimes," Gabriel began, his voice still weak but clear. "The other kids said mean things about her, but I just thought she looked sad and lonely, like I feel sometimes." The judge nodded, encouraging him to continue. "One day I shared my lunch with her and I found out she was really nice. She told me funny stories and never asked for anything. She just wanted to be my friend." Gabriel paused, looking at Maria with pure adoration. "And when the bad men tried to take me, she protected me. She got hurt to save me." The judge then turned to Maria. "And you, Maria? How do you feel about Gabriel?" Maria took a moment to gather her thoughts, clearly unaccustomed to being the center of attention. She looked at the judge with her large, dark eyes, filled with a wisdom no child should possess. "Gabriel is the first person who wasn't scared of me," she said, her voice small but firm. "After my mum died, everyone looked at me like I was dangerous or dirty, but Gabriel looked at me like I was normal." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Every word from Maria resonated with a brutal honesty that touched everyone present. He shared his food with me, even when I said I wasn't hungry. He knew I was lying, but he never made me say it. Gabriel squeezed her hand, encouraging her. "And when the bad men came," Maria continued, her voice trembling slightly, "I knew I had to protect Gabriel. Not because anyone told me to, but because when you really love someone, you do anything to stop bad things from happening to them." Judge Harrison discreetly wiped away a tear. In 30 years on the bench, he had rarely heard a purer definition of love and loyalty. "Maria," he said gently, "how would you feel if you had to be separated from Gabriel?" The question struck Maria like a physical blow. Her small hands began to shake, and she looked desperately at Gabriel, as if he might vanish at any moment. I don't know how to live without my best friend," she whispered. "He's the only family I have now." Gabriel, seeing Maria's despair, found a strength he didn't know he had. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rising with determination, "I know I'm just a kid, but can I say something important?" The judge nodded, impressed by the boy's maturity. "My dad was always too busy to play with me or really talk to me," Gabriel began, and Edward felt his heartbreak. "I used to feel really lonely, even living in a big house with lots of things. But when I met Maria, I found out what it feels like to have someone who really cares about you." Gabriel looked directly at Edward, and there was no anger in his eyes, only a devastating honesty. "Dad, I know you love me, but you never knew how to show it. Maria taught me that love is about being there, about really caring, about sharing what you have even when you don't have much." Gabriel's words echoed through the room like bells of truth. Edward closed his eyes, finally understanding the full extent of his failure as a father. It wasn't just about time or attention. It was about genuine emotional connection, about being truly present in the moments that mattered. "If you separate us," Gabriel continued, tears now streaming down his face, "it'll be like taking half of my heart away. Maria isn't just my friend, she's my sister in my heart, and siblings shouldn't be separated." Mr. Reed stood to formally present the custody petition, but the judge stopped him with a gesture. Before the legal arguments, he said, "I'd like to hear from Mr. Thorne, not what the lawyers have prepared, but from the heart. Why do you believe you should have custody of Maria?" Edward rose, feeling the weight of every decision he'd ever made converging on this single moment. "Your Honor," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "for years, I believed that being a good father meant providing for my son financially. I worked obsessively to build an empire to secure Gabriel's future." He paused, looking at the two children who were watching him with total focus. "But I almost lost my son because of that obsession. While I was building wealth, Gabriel was developing diabetes without me even noticing. While I was closing deals, he was forming a friendship that would save his life." Edward knelt in front of the children, speaking directly to them, but knowing his words were for the entire room. "Maria taught me what true courage and unconditional love mean. A 6-year-old girl risked her own life to save my son, something I, with all my resources, failed to do because I wasn't paying attention." "But more than that," Edward continued, his voice growing with conviction, "Maria taught me that family isn't defined by blood or legal documents. It's defined by love, mutual care, and the commitment to be there in the hardest moments. Gabriel and Maria are already a family in the only way that truly matters." The judge watched the interaction, noticing how Gabriel and Maria had drawn closer to Edward during his speech, as if naturally pulled in by his sincerity. "Mr. Thorne," he asked, "what changed in you?" Edward smiled through his tears. "Your Honor, I discovered that true wealth isn't measured by how much money you accumulate, but by how many hearts you touch. Maria touched Gabriel's heart and saved his life. Gabriel touched Maria's heart and gave her hope, and together they touched my heart and taught me how to be a real father." Just then, a new voice rose in the courtroom. It was Carla Reynolds, the social worker. "Your Honor," she said, standing slowly, "in 15 years of working with at-risk children, I have never seen a bond so genuine and mutually beneficial. To separate Gabriel and Maria now would be to institutionalize trauma, not to protect them from it." Judge Harrison stood and walked silently around the room, absorbing the emotional weight of the moment. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew the next few minutes would determine the fate of two children whose lives had already been marked by loss and trauma. Gabriel held Maria's hand so tightly his knuckles were white, while she whispered words of encouragement in his ear. "In 30 years as a judge," the magistrate finally said, returning to his bench, "I have learned that the law exists to serve justice, not the other way around. And justice, in cases like this, must always consider the best interest of the child, not bureaucratic procedures, not administrative convenience, but what genuinely protects and nurtures the well-being of vulnerable human beings." Edward felt his heart pound so hard he was sure the whole room could hear it. This was the moment that would define not only Maria's future, but his own chance at redemption. He looked at Gabriel, who, despite his physical fragility, radiated a determination. "That astounded everyone. Your Honor," Gabriel said suddenly, surprising everyone by standing up. "Can I say one more thing?" The judge nodded, clearly touched by the boy's courage. Gabriel walked to the center of the room, bringing Maria with him. "I want everyone to know I'm not asking you to let Maria stay with me just because I like her," Gabriel said, his small voice filled with conviction. "I'm asking because she needs a family as much as I need her. And my dad has finally learned how to be a real dad." Maria nodded vigorously. "Gabriel taught me. There's good in the world," she said, looking directly at the judge. "And Mr. Thorne showed me that some grown-ups keep their promises. I've never had a real family, but now I know what it feels like to have people who care about me." Then, something completely unexpected happened. Carlos Martinez, flanked by 2 police officers, was brought into the courtroom in handcuffs. The judge had ordered his presence, wanting to fully understand the circumstances that had led to this situation. "Carlos Martinez," the judge said grimly, "you stand accused of conspiracy to kidnap, corporate fraud, and the destruction of innocent lives. Do you have anything to say before I make my decision about the future of these children?" Martinez, visibly shaken and remorseful, looked at Maria with tears in his eyes. I destroyed her mother's life," he said, his voice breaking. "Anna Coleman was an honest woman who discovered my crimes, and I condemned her to die on the streets to protect myself. Her daughter," he looked at Maria, "her daughter is braver and more honest than I ever was." He turned to Edward with an expression of profound regret. "Edward, you were a better friend than I deserved. And Gabriel has a pure heart that I almost destroyed out of greed." Martinez took a deep breath. "Your Honor, if my testimony can help in any way, I want to state for the record that Edward Thorne is a man of integrity who was betrayed by my ambition. He had no knowledge of any of my illegal activities. And these children, they deserve to be together." Maria saved Gabriel from my own evil. The impact of Martinez's testimony was electric. Even the prosecutor, who had come prepared to question Edward's fitness as an adoptive parent, was clearly moved. The judge called for a brief recess. In the 15 minutes that followed, Edward sat on the hallway floor with Gabriel and Maria, the 3 of them forming a small, intimate circle away from the surrounding chaos. "No matter what happens," Edward said, "I want you to know that you've already changed my life forever. Gabriel, you taught me that being a father is about being present, not providing things. And Maria, you showed me that true courage is protecting the ones you love, even when it costs you everything." Maria leaned her head on Edward's shoulder for the first time. "Mr. Edward," she said softly, "if you really want to be my dad, I promise to be the best daughter I can be. I'll take care of Gabriel and help you be a better dad too." Gabriel laughed through his tears. "Maria, you're already the best sister in the world. And Dad," he looked at Edward with a love he hadn't shown in years, "you're already a better dad. You're here with us when we need you, and that's all that matters." When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Harrison was standing, holding an official document. His expression was solemn, but there was a light in his eyes that offered hope. After considering all aspects of this extraordinary case, the judge began, including the psychological reports, the testimony of the parties involved, and most importantly, observing the genuine connection between these two children, I have reached the following decision. Edward's heart stopped. Gabriel and Maria hugged each other instinctively, bracing for what could be their final separation or the beginning of a new life. I hereby grant immediate temporary custody of Maria Coleman to Edward Thorne, the judge declared, and an explosion of joy erupted in the room. Gabriel shouted with happiness, Maria began to sob with relief, and Edward felt his heart might burst with gratitude. Furthermore, the judge continued, waiting for silence, I authorize the immediate start of formal adoption proceedings to be expedited due to the extraordinary circumstances of this case. Carla Reynolds approached, tears in her eyes. Mr. Thorne, she said, in my 15-year career, this is the first time I've seen the system work exactly as it should. These children will be under my supervision during the adoption process, but I am certain it will be merely a formality. In the days that followed, Edward's life changed completely. He sold the mansion and bought a smaller, cozier house where the children could truly feel at home. Maria got her own room for the first time, decorated in soft colors and filled with books and toys she was still learning to think of as her own. It was most touching to watch Gabriel transform with Maria as his sister. His natural shyness gave way to a growing confidence, and he became as protective of her as she had been of him. They developed unique rituals. Every morning, Gabriel would check Maria's glucose levels, though she wasn't diabetic, and Maria would prepare a special breakfast for Gabriel with foods that were right for his condition. Edward had fulfilled his promise to create the Anna Coleman Foundation. 3 months after the hearing, the foundation had already helped 20 children off the streets, offering not just shelter and food, but educational programs and psychological support. Maria insisted on visiting the foundation regularly, helping other children adjust. Dad, Gabriel said one afternoon, as the three of them did homework at the kitchen table, can I tell you a secret? Edward stopped reviewing foundation documents and gave his son his full attention. Of course, son, you can tell me anything. When I was in the hospital before you changed, I used to pray to God to give me a real family, Gabriel confessed. Looking between Edward and Maria, not a rich or famous family, but a family where people really loved each other and were always there for each other. Maria smiled and took Gabriel's hand. And now you have one, she said simply. We have one. Edward felt tears prick his eyes, realizing that for the first time in his adult life, he was truly happy. Not from professional achievements or accumulated wealth, but from the pure joy of being present in the lives of the people he loved. Carlos Martinez was sentenced to 15 years in prison. All his fraudulently obtained assets were seized and donated to the Anna Coleman Foundation, a poetic justice that was not lost on Edward. 6 months after the hearing, the adoption was finalized. The same Judge Harrison presided, but this time, the mood was one of pure celebration. Maria wore a light blue dress she had picked out, and Gabriel wore a matching tie. His idea, so it would look more official. Maria Coleman Thorne, the judge said solemnly, but with a clear smile, welcome officially to your new family. That night, Edward tucked both children into bed. Gabriel was almost asleep when he whispered, Dad, thank you for giving us a real family. And Maria, in her room next door, fell asleep hugging a photo of her mother, finally at peace, knowing Anna would have been proud. Weeks later, Edward walked hand in hand with Gabriel and Maria down the same streets where it had all begun. But now, instead of despair, there was hope and love in every step. The children laughed, telling stories about their new school, where they were known simply as Gabriel and Maria, inseparable siblings. The alley where Edward had found them had been transformed. With help from the city and funding from the Anna Coleman Foundation, it was now a small community park called the Garden of Hope. Where there had once been only darkness, colorful flowers now grew. A plaque dedicated the garden to the memory of Anna Coleman. "Mom would be really happy seeing this," Maria said, touching her mother's name on the polished bronze. "She always said bad places could become good places if good people took care of them." "Dad," Gabriel said, sitting on a new park bench, "do you regret not being CEO anymore?" Edward sat between his two children, hugging them close. "Gabriel, I spent years chasing money and power, thinking that would make me happy. But real happiness was right here, waiting for me to be smart enough to see it." He looked at Maria, who had snuggled against his shoulder. "You too taught me that true success is measured by the hearts we touch, not the zeros in our bank account." Maria looked up at him. "Mr. Dad," she said, still getting used to the word, "when I lived on the street, I used to come here at night because it was quiet and I could see the stars. I'd make wishes, asking for my mom to be okay and asking to find a family who would really love me." She paused, looking at Gabriel. "When I met Gabriel, I knew the stars had heard me. I could help someone. And by helping, I found my family." Edward felt tears roll down his face. "You know what I've learned?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I learned that sometimes you have to lose almost everything to find out what really matters. I almost lost Gabriel to neglect, and I almost lost the chance to know Maria by being too busy to notice what was important." Gabriel stood and hugged him tightly. "But you didn't lose us, Dad. You found us, and we found you. And now we're a family forever." Maria joined the hug. As they walked home, Edward reflected on the journey. The dark alley had become a garden of hope. The abandoned girl had become his beloved daughter. The neglected son had become his greatest teacher. And he, the billionaire, had learned that true wealth lies in presence, care, and the love we share with our chosen family. That night, Edward told them a story. The story of a man who thought he had everything, but discovered he had nothing, until two extraordinary children taught him the true meaning of love, family, and purpose. "And did they live happily ever after?" Gabriel asked, using the classic fairy tale ending. Edward smiled, looking at his two children nestled beside him on the sofa. "They lived," he answered, "building happiness together, one day at a time, always remembering that true love is the greatest adventure of all."